Sometimes you want to build a world that's not Earth. You want to make an alien world with strange creatures and a landscape filled with drinkable dust. But where do you start? How do you build a realistic world that will draw your reader in and give them enough familiarity that the world makes sense to them, and yet leave them feeling as though they have traveled to the furthest reaches of space? Today, let's talk about building crazy, weird, and out there worlds. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. This video is sponsored by World Anvil, a set of world building tools that helps you create, organize, and store your world setting. Today, we're talking about truly weird worlds with strange atmosphere and crazy fauna and flora. I can't think of a better tool than World Anvil for organizing your notes in such a setting. With their wiki-like articles, interactive maps, and the timelines available to organize what has happened in your world, they've got you covered no matter if you're running a campaign or writing a novel. If you want to use World Anvil, you can sign up for free following my link down below. And if you're ready to go for a subscription, you can use my link to get a 10% discount on an annual subscription. And thank you very much to World Anvil for supporting my content. Okay, enough of that. Let's crack on. So first, just a disclaimer, I am predominantly a fantasy fan and a fantasy writer, so my approach to building crazy weird worlds is that of science fantasy, not science fiction, and definitely not hard science fiction. Probably nothing that I do will stand up to any kind of scientific scrutiny, so if that's what you're looking for, you're probably not going to find it in this video. I'm going to approach this out of something that makes sense if you look at it through the fantasy lens. Okay, with that out the way, let's get on with it. First, you should define your geology. And by this, I don't just mean the mountains and the kind of areas where you have liquid flow, whether that's water or something else, or the ocean equivalent. I mean, you need to define what your atmosphere is. So, for example, it wouldn't make sense to have a completely weird world where people bleed white if you have oxygen and iron in your world. So what you want to do is you want to change your atmosphere and then think about the effects that that will have on the rest of your world. So for example, if you had a hydrogen-based atmosphere, do you have a higher gravity because it needs to hold the hydrogen down? Or does the atmosphere cloud just expand massively around your world and sit around it like this huge aura? Based on that, you need to define what a resource-rich area in your world looks like. So an area with potentially lots of hydrogen, an area with ethanol, an area where whatever it is that life on your world needs is abundant, and where that would be. Would it be close to your world's equator? Would it be up at the poles? Would it be somewhere in the middle? What would a resource-poor area look like? Potentially, in such a world, it could even be something like water is resource poor. So areas which would be wetlands would be the equivalent of deserts or something like that. So think about what would resource rich look like for life on that world, and what would resource poor look like for life on that world. And then, of course, things like mountains and canyons and all kinds of attributes like that. And if you want more details on that, there is a link down below to my video on landmarks and their creation in a fantasy world. Okay, so once you have kind of a rough idea of the geology, and remember you're going to be doing all of this kind of at once, so get a rough idea, move on, come back, etc. Once you have a rough idea of the geology, think about what your creatures should look like in your mind. So, do you want to have creatures that have white flesh? Do you want their skin tone to be sky blue? Do you want them to bleed white? What do you want their skeletons to be made of? What internal energy do you want them to have? We have a kind of electrical energy, and life on our world probably evoked from electrical energy. But what if you turned that into thermal energy? What if these creatures were natural fire breathers? What if that was how life evoked here with heat? So people are almost like an internal combustion engine on the inside. That kind of thought process will then bring to mind things like what you want the skeleton made out of, what you want blood made out of, and what your flesh colors are. Once you have a very rough idea of what you want these creatures to look like, it's time to talk about food chains. Now, not all environments reach a kind of equilibrium that allows the evolution of higher life forms. Many of the basic life forms, the kind of one-celled organisms, they die before they can become more than that. But if you are going to have higher intelligent life, you need to reach a kind of state of equilibrium, and that means that you need food chains. Food chains is the sequence of transfer of matter and energy from one organism to another. So energy is always wasted in this process. In our world, it's wasted as heat energy. But in your world, that waste could generate electrical energy or cold energy, or some kind of energy is generated from this process of eating organisms, which is the process of the transfer of energy. So give some thought to your waste product. But food chains are much more important than just your waste product. There are 3 types of food chains. The first is the predator food chain, and this is the one I guess we're all the most familiar with. You have producers that make food from your environment. So in our world, these are represented by plants who create food for the rest of the food chain through photosynthesis with sunlight and the intake of CO2. And they expel, as a waste product from this process, they expel O2, oxygen. Herbivores eat producers. So in our case, this would be represented by cows, sheep, manatees, all of these kinds of creatures that eat the primary producers and get their energy from that process. And then carnivores eat herbivores. So lions, humans, etc., those who eat the eaters of producers. So that is what defines a predatory chain. And on your world, you will need to have some of these chains. So you will need to have producers, herbivores, and carnivores in order to make those food chains work. But they're not the only food chain. You can also have a parasitic food chain, which is a parasite that feeds on your carnivore or your herbivore or your plants. Examples of parasite include ticks, the alum bark beetle, etc. Now, the big deal with parasitical food chains is that A, they don't cause death, and B, they also need the producers. You are going to need the producers no matter what. Now, parasites can also be fed on by smaller parasites, so you can have a multi-stage parasitical food chain where a parasite feeds on a herbivore and another parasite feeds on that parasite, etc. It's parasites all the way down. And then the last type of food chain is the saprophyte food chain. Now, these are organisms that live on dead organic matter. For example, mushrooms. So these guys decompose and eat decomposing matter. Of course, for there to be dead organic matter, you have to have your producers in the first place to produce organic matter. When you are creating your world, in broad strokes, you are going to need producers, parasites, something to break down the dead, herbivores, and carnivores. You have to have at least something in each of these categories, probably starting with what is your producer and what does it create the energy from? because it doesn't have to be the sun. In a hydrogen world, it could absorb the hydrogen and eject, I don't know, water as a waste product, for example. So give some thought to what produces energy on your world, and then everything that eats it and feeds off it. And if you enjoyed talking about food chains and food webs, hit the thumbs up button. And let's talk about things to think about when creating these species. So, the first thing that you should think about is which are your keystone species in which of those geological environments that we talked about. A keystone species is a species that is critical to the survival of others in its community. Not all species are equally important. Some help to ensure equilibrium. An example of this from the animal side of the equation is the starfish Pisaster ocraceus. In the marine intertidal communities off the northwest coast of America, these starfish feed off the mussels Mytilus californius. And during experiments where this starfish has been removed from those communities, these mussels completely take over the shores and they crowd out every other species until there is nothing but mussels. So these starfish are a keystone for the survival of every other species in this environment. From the plant side of the equation, the figs in tropical America are a pretty critical plant. They bear fruit year round, and there are a plethora of animals in all seasons who are dependent on this food source. So these birds and these animals would die if the fig tree were removed from the environment. So when you're creating your environment that you're setting up, whether that is a tropical zone with rich resources or a desert type environment with very poor resources, think about what your keystone species is and why. Is it because they produce food, or is it because they hunt an otherwise dominant species that would take over the environment? Give that some thought and create that species to control that part of your environment. The other thing that you should think about when you're setting up your species is mutualism. So, mutualism is where one species helps another, whether they appear to be antagonistic species or not. A great example of this is fish cleaning stations that I spoke about in my tools and underwater homes video, where you have fish that clean parasites off other fish despite the fact that they, look like they should be the prey of that kind of fish. Insects that pollinate plants are also a great example of this kind of mutualism. The insects get food and the plants get their seeds spread far and wide. Fun fact to remember with mutualism is often there will also be cheater mutualism that develops, which is, for example, the fake cleaner fish in the ocean, where it looks like a cleaner fish, it hangs out in a cleaning station, but when the fish rocks up to be cleaned and it opens its mouth, the fake cleaner fish goes inside its mouth and actually starts eating it like on the inside, eating away at its mouth and so on, and it kills the fish that's come to the cleaning station. So don't forget about fake mutualism. Often, these kinds of species that are engaged in mutualism co-evolve. For example, insects have grown better at distributing the pollen of the plants they are adapted to, and those plants have grown better at producing the pollen that works for those insects until it reaches the point where it looks as though these two species were made for each other. But really, all that happened was through natural selection, the specimens that were the best geared for survival were the ones who survived and thrived. Another thing to think about is ecological succession. So during my forest making video, which you can check out in the link, I did speak about how a forest is formed from an open field. I spoke about the fact that you get pioneer species that go out, and when they establish themselves, they actually make the soil richer for other plants to come into that environment and for a forest to start building. And you need to think about that kind of ecological succession. Which species are pioneer species? Which species can make the ground richer, can go into a resource poor area and start making it more resource rich? And of course, the reverse. Which species, be it plant or animal, contributes to making an area poorer? Which species encourages your world's version of desertification? And lastly, of course, because this is a fantasy channel, even if we're discussing a more sciencey topic today, don't forget about magic in your world. How does magic interact with these creatures? Is magic part of the environment? Are there sources of magic that bubble up to the surface? Are some of your creatures innate magicians who can use portions of the power of magic to affect the world around them? And those are my thoughts on creating a weird and wonderful world. If you enjoyed this video, hit the thumbs up button and maybe check out my playlist on creating fauna and flora in fantasy worlds. And if you want to connect around this or any other videos, remember that I do have a Discord server linked down below, and I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time Worlds.